Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. For the last few days, I've been getting these little organized caravans of whiners coming on my channel. They didn't like the video that I did, where I simply pointed out that all of these white supremacist nerds are the biggest problem that so-called pop culture has. Now, I can tell because there was this quick influx of them that came in. Clearly, one of the perpetually butthurt racist geeks must have seen my video and went into a tizzy and told their brain-dead, meth-huffing followers to go ahead and give me a visit. Well, since you didn't like my last video, let me make you really hot under the collar. We need to call these punks what they are, Nazi nerds. That's where a lot of these people came from. A lot of them happen to be your garden variety, run-of-the-mill white supremacists who normally would be on Stormfront. In fact, a lot of them are there. And what happened was these clowns wanted to call themselves, deciding that they would try to find new blood, new recruits. See, they figured that the best way to try to reach young white people with their message would be to go where the young white people are at, and that happens to be largely around entertainment, video games, and movies specifically. And then they take the same old white supremacist talking points that they have been using in the 80s and 90s and aughts and such, their old material, the recycled talking points. We need to get black people out of these universities because they're taking the universities, they're taking the jobs, etc., etc. And they just replace universities and jobs with Star Wars and comic books. It's the same moral panic and phony racial outrage that they've always trafficked in. They flew off the handle after Obama got re-elected. His election was bad enough, but the re-election, that's when the wheels came off the loony wagon. And they failed to get any sort of real traction going on the ground, basically on the streets or the legislatures, and 2020 was their wake-up call that they're living on borrowed time. Now, don't get me wrong, they're far from beaten, but white supremacists are ultra hypersensitive to anything that even remotely might look like a challenge to them. So when they see a few stress fractures in the edifice of their power, to them that's a 5-alarm fire. That's why there's only been one black superhero movie, and yet you have these white supremacist racists screaming, "We're losing everything! The movies are all woke! All the characters are all black!" And they sit around in their little groups of losers repeating these old talking points to each other, basically brainwashing one another, and you can tell it was a small load of wash. That's why Bethany Mandel looked like the idiot she did the other day. White supremacy requires that they control not only what exists, but also what people think as well. So when they see anything that threatens the status quo, they have to go into hysterics about it, and become violent, and scream that they face an existential crisis. That's why when they saw one lonely little black stormtrooper in a Star Wars movie, they began shrieking, "This is white genocide." To justify their white supremacist control, they pushed lying narratives. The main one is that we don't see more images of black people because, well, nobody wants to see black people. That's the reason why there aren't more movies that have black people in them, and we shouldn't have to see them because black people just don't sell. That's not just an outright lie, but it's also a lie by omission. First of all, most of the movies that go to theaters fail to make money, and the overwhelming majority of them star white people, especially white male actors. Only 2 or 3 starring black people go to theaters every year, and at least half of them make a profit, or at the very least they earn out. That means that at a minimum the studios recoup whatever money they put into the production of the movie. So, to use the white supremacist favorite talking point, when you look at the movies per capita, you see that black movies are far more profitable and successful than the ones with white leads. You flood the multiplex with white-led movies and most of them die over opening weekend. And the picture becomes even worse when you look at so-called blockbusters, which is where the studios make their money. Recently you had the release of Creed 3, and it became a major hit already. 2 black men were the leads in that movie. It currently has earned $246 million worldwide. On its debut weekend, it raked in $58 million, blowing away all industry estimates. Now, compare that to Shazam 2, the superhero flick that came out 2 weeks ago. Its opening weekend made $30 million, and currently it only has $100 million worldwide, with a rather anemic $45 million domestic. Oh, and Shazam 2 is in more movie theaters than Creed 3, 4,071 theaters compared to Creed's 4,007. And sure, Shazam 2 hasn't been out as long as Creed 3, but when you look at the second weekend drop, you see that 79% of the people who showed up to see Shazam 2 on its opening weekend didn't come back to see it again. A movie can only make hundreds of millions of dollars if it can get repeat viewings from the audience. When nearly 80% of the people who saw the movie didn't come back, that also means they're telling other people they can skip this one too, which they have. And Shazam 2 is not the only recent example. Scream 6, which is led by a white cast, did better than Shazam 2, but not by much, and certainly didn't do better than Creed 3. Scream 6 opened to $44 million on its debut weekend, and people thought that meant it was going to do monster numbers. But its second weekend, it nosedived with a drop of 73%. So 3/4 of the people who saw it on opening weekend didn't bother to come back, and they didn't tell a friend to go see it either. Compare the freefall that Shazam and Scream 6 had to Creed 3. I'm not crapping on Shazam 2, because the latest Marvel movie did poorly as well, but Quantumania, you'll recall, has a white male lead too, and a white woman as a co-star. And they also had a huge drop on their second weekend as well. So when will we have these Nazi nerds screaming that movies with white leads just don't sell? Well, they're not going to, because this isn't about math, it's not about profits, it's about pushing an anti-black narrative. Because you can choose any year you want, and when you look at the worst performing movies from any given year, they're practically all movies with white leads and white male leads in specific. So the numbers make it clear who fails at the box office. These Nazi nerds may have the luxury of deciding that they can crap on movies that make lots of money, but if you're the people who actually run the studios, you don't have the luxury of ignoring the math. The narrative that the Nazi nerds have been trying to push is that any movie that has black people in it is automatically woke. But studios don't listen to whining like that because they only care about the numbers. As I explained in my last video, Curb Stomping These Punks, Gina Carano's career is over because the same Nazi nerds who claim to love her so much couldn't leave their mother's basements long enough to see her so-called movie. And afterwards they began attacking her Daily Wire flick as woke. No cure for stupid. And here's a few more examples of the neo-Nazi nerds failing. When Spider-Man No Way Home was announced, Sony said that Zendaya would be playing the part of Mary Jane. So predictably, the Nazi nerds went into phony outrage about it. They screamed all their typical buzzwords, forced diversity, woke, and that audiences are sick and tired of this and they won't go see this woke crap. They shrieked that it would die over opening weekend, that Spider-Man No Way Home had no chance to make a profit. Basically all the same crap they said about House of the Dragon when they saw a black man in the cast. Well, Spider-Man No Way Home and his Black Mary Jane broke box office records. In fact, it did so well it broke the records of the previous Spider-Man movies. It's now the top-performing Spider-Man movie of all time. It was an undeniable runaway success, and now it's the 7th highest-grossing movie of all time. Not just the 7th highest-grossing superhero movie of all time, but the 7th highest-grossing movie, period. Star Wars The Force Awakens and its Black Stormtrooper sits at number 5 of all time. These same Nazi nerds also said that Avatar 2 was woke, and it has Zoe Saldana in it, so it's forced diversity, woke, and that audiences are sick and tired of this and won't go see this woke crap. They also attacked James Cameron, saying that his movies are nothing more than liberal environmentalist agitprop. And it's not 2012, they said. There's no 3D glasses to make this movie a must-see flick this time around. And in an interview shortly before Avatar 2's release, James Cameron was quoted as saying that the movie would have to make $2 billion back just to be profitable, given all the money that went into the research and development of making it. And the Nazi nerds began licking their chops. At that point, they thought this was a guaranteed W for them. They said, oh, that's impossible. There's no way Avatar 2 is going to make $2 billion. Avatar 2 is going to die over opening weekend. There's no 3D glasses this time to make it a must-see flick. There's no way it's going to make $2 billion. Well, they were right. Avatar 2 didn't make $2 billion. So far, it's made $2.3 billion and counting, and it's the number 3 highest grossing movie of all time. Oh, and by the way, when the neo-Nazi nerds saw that happen, they immediately did a shift, just like they did with House of the Dragon, just like they did with Spider-Man No Way Home, and all of a sudden they were saying, well, you know, Avatar 2 does have a strong male lead, and that's the reason why it made You see how that one works. And you remember that Batman movie that starred what's-his-name from Twilight? They cast Zoe Kravitz as Catwoman. No big deal, right? After all, Eartha Kitt was the original Catwoman back in the 60s on that god-awful Batman show. And these Nazi nerds revere that show, right? Well, not anymore, because we live in the post-MAGA world where they must pretend to hate what they used to love. So when Zoe Kravitz was announced as Catwoman, we got the usual whining about, say it with me, forced diversity, woke, and that audiences are sick and tired of this and won't go see this woke crap and it's going to die over opening weekend, blah, blah, blah. Well, the Batman went on to make over $770 million, and the sequel is going to begin filming soon. So we see all these movies that these Nazi nerds whine about. They make a big deal about it whenever a film occasionally underperforms. Even movies that they hadn't attacked, if it was a big production, a big movie that fails, they jump on it anyway and say, well, it failed because it was woke. This is trying to create a false association in people's minds, is what they're trying to do. But reality always gets the last word, because these neo-Nazi nerds always fall completely silent whenever the movies that they claim are going to fail over opening weekend instead go on to set box office records, and to do so consistently. They also try to change their tune when Spider-Man No Way Home set box office records. They suddenly began acting like they were on board with it all along. White supremacy believes in taking both sides of the conversation. Thank you, Neely Fuller. This is why the studios don't listen to these Nazi nerds. Why would they? These clowns have been wrong for so long, only an idiot would even listen to them. You look at Daily Wire. Are they a rival to Disney? Or are they a rival to Warner Brothers, or Paramount, or Universal, or Lionsgate, or Sony? Hell, is Daily Wire even a rival to Tyler Perry, or Blumhouse Studios for that matter? Daily Wire serves up the kind of reaffirming slop that these Nazi nerds demand, and it's a tiny, failing vanity project by a racist shrinky-dink. In addition to being racist, Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, Michael Knowles, and Steven Crowder also have something else in common. They've all failed to make it in entertainment. Michael Knowles is a failed actor. Shapiro is both a failed musician and writer. Crowder is a failed comedy writer, and Tucker Carlson failed to become a TV anchor on a real network, so he retreated to Fox News. When these clowns failed to get traction in the entertainment world, which is where they really wanted to be, they instead decided to reinvent themselves as angry white commentators who attacked the media that they couldn't get into full time. Crowder failed to make anyone laugh when he tried and failed to be a comedian, so instead he tries to be offensive, because at least that's something he can actually do. That's what drives them. Pure bitterness, sour grapes. They failed to hack it in the industry that they wanted to be in, so they figured if we can't make money in the industry, at the very least we'll try to make money off of it by trashing it full time. These racists have a niche, but it's the worst kind, the kind that doesn't grow. None of them are anywhere near as successful as the studios who they attack. Their predictions of doom and failure for the studios and networks have all been wrong, but it gives them job security, though it keeps their audiences angry, because their viewers are waiting to see when their predictions of media studio collapse will finally come true so that they can stop seeing black people's faces on movie screens. And they're mad because after a decade it hasn't happened, and it's not going to. If you do what Ben Shapiro does, you'll get the results that Ben Shapiro's gotten. Now, what studio or media executive in their right mind wants to trade places with Ben Shapiro? Which one of them would like to trade in their balance sheet for the balance sheet of the Daily Wire, or any of these other right-wing racists who you see whining online? Do you think any of these studio executives would actually trade the $800 million they make at the box office for the $800 Ben Shapiro generates? If you're trying to run a major studio and not some white racist vanity project, which one makes more sense to you? There's absolutely nobody at any studio who wants to trade places with Ben Shapiro. Nobody looks at that small contingent of whining white racists online as being some sort of growth market. What Disney is doing works. Sure, the loudmouth morons online don't like it, but unless you live your life on a steady diet of right-wing nut propaganda, they don't matter. Oh, they loved it when Dave Chappelle said that he wasn't worried about what the transgender critics had to say because Twitter isn't real. But what these Nazi nerds don't realize is that includes them too. The only place that they have any sort of notoriety or attention happens to be online. Dave Chappelle simply said out loud the same thing that the executives at these studios think about these Nazi nerds. Their profits are not determined by what some sawed-off Nazi nerd says on Twitter or on YouTube. The moguls who run these studios are not about to abandon the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars they're making now just so they can get a like or a thumbs up from some online Nazi nerds. You can't pay the bills with that. They only care about numbers. And that's what makes these Nazi nerds so mad. They know that the vast majority of movies that flop at the box office happen to star white actors, usually white male actors. And they also know that the white studio executives are almost all white males, so they keep making a ton of white-led movies, regardless of how many of them fail, which is most of them. And they pay these white leading men big paychecks, which they consistently fail to recoup. It's the epitome of failing upwards. So why would Nazi nerds who themselves have failed their entire lives want to see anyone institute a meritocracy? That's what really scares them. White supremacy is a system of goodies, giveaways, and most of all, guarantees handed to those classified as white. It's the biggest grift in human history, which explains why all these Nazi nerds want to be part of it. They are the epitome of selective outrage. They attack anything with black people in it, then when it becomes successful, they shut up about it because they can't claim it went broke. Well, the studio sees this silence, and they realize these guys are just background noise. That's why none of these studios are changing what they're doing, because what they're doing works. It may not please absolutely every single person, but it doesn't have to either. When you're making billions of dollars, you don't worry about the handful of people who didn't like it. It wasn't meant for them. That's how things go when you deal with grown-ups. Adults don't listen to whiny babies. And the brain-dead inbred fans of these Nazi nerds actually wonder why these studios ignore them. And they will keep wondering because there's no cure for stupid. And of course, the biggest, loudest, and wrongest voices of these Nazi nerds are the ones who are just running a pure grift. They figured out that there's a cottage industry for phony white outrage, and there's a few morons trying to make money off of them because the states still haven't eliminated the mental health budgets yet, so these lobotomized bigots still get money from the state. The idiot economy still has some life left in it, but until those budget cuts finally happen, we can reflect on how these chumps have taken L after L after L. Recently, we've seen the next phase of this phony white outrage grift. It takes the form of these white supremacists saying that they're going to do their own little media projects. And of course, you've had a number of these rubes who have done crowdfunding, and they've managed to raise even upwards of 7 figures. But so what? That's not going to change anything. There's been plenty of examples of white supremacists who have raised 7 figures from their knuckle-dragging community, and they've all failed to do anything. Nothing ever comes from it. They're flash-in-the-pan vanity projects. Not one of them ever becomes a going concern. They do one so-called comic book or one so-called movie, and that's it. Not one of them, even the ones who have raised 7 figures, has demonstrated that they have the ability to put out a publication monthly or quarterly or even annually. You cannot run a business when you have no frequency of product. And the same for their movies. None of them can make a franchise out of the dreck they produce because nobody wants to see it other than the same mouth-breathing neckbeards on YouTube. And as we saw with Gina Carano, even the racist basement dwellers don't want to see it. Though in some of their cases, the problems these projects have are worse than you might think. For example, there was one white supremacist vanity project called Rebels Run. This was a so-called comic book put together by a dyed-in-the-wool white supremacist who wanted to celebrate the Confederate flag because of all the great things it represents, like slavery, and losing a war so badly you still haven't gotten over it yet, and slavery. This guy is also the type who thinks the FBI is an anti-white federal gang run by Black Lives Matter and that the FBI needs to be defunded and disbanded because people don't need the FBI. Now, the guy who this white supremacist hired to write the story for this hate tract is Chuck Dixon. Chuck Dixon was a comic book writer whose heyday was back in the 90s. He's pretty much known for only one thing. He created the comic book character Bane. If you saw The Dark Knight Rises, you know who that is. And I think that's worth pointing out because he gets paid money every time that character is used in a movie or video game or what have you. I hope that some of you folks in my audience who happen to like comic book movies or any of the geek fare are starting to realize why I don't get enthused about these comic book movies or TV shows and whatnot. I'm not saying that there's anything inherently wrong with them, but I think you need to understand who makes the kind of media that you consume, and a number of them are dyed-in-the-wool anti-black racists. Anyway, I don't know how well this Rebels Run comic book sold, but apparently the racists who dreamt it up decided to try and make a movie out of it. Well, with Rebels Run, they allegedly crowdfunded $1 million. Those state mental health budget cuts can't come fast enough for me. Your tax dollars at work, family. The genius white supremacist behind this scheme decided to take the money that he crowdfunded and put it into a bank that had a name that practically screamed fly-by-night operation. A bank that claims it caters to the unbankable. The guy behind the bank acted like some phony Instagram influencer. You know the type. He poses with fancy cars and claims to be rich. All of that projecting success nonsense. Well, you won't be surprised to learn the guy who owned this bank is also a crypto bro. Oh, say it ain't so. If you can't trust the crypto bros, you can't trust anyone. It's nothing sacred. The bank owner took the $1 million in angry white rage donations, and he used it to pay off some other financial debt that he had. By the way, the same white right-wing racist who came up with this Rebels Run idea, you know, the guy who thinks the FBI is an anti-white federal gang run by Black Lives Matters and they need to be defunded and we don't need them. Well, he ran to the FBI and asked them to investigate this incident. I guess he needed them. So it's all become this big mess because white supremacists are inherently stupid. The money is all gone, which just goes to show Gordon Gekko was right. A fool and his money never should have been together in the first place. Now, if any of this sounds familiar, it should. This was the exact same formula of failure that Ben Shapiro followed when he made that crappy Gina Carano movie. You know, the one that made $800 at the box office. Another thing that's familiar is that the racists who call themselves making these movies or comic books or whatever, they don't have a background in filmmaking. And worse than that, they don't even want to tell a story. They just want to preach a sermon. They seem to think that making a movie is as simple as getting a camera and having someone stand in front of it. They haven't mastered their craft at all, mainly because filmmaking isn't their craft. Hating black people is. But nobody's going to pay money to see the most pampered demographic in society attempt to play the victim, or try to pretend that their cheap, vile racism is anything other than cheap, vile racism. In every movie and TV show ever made, these racist white supremacists are the bad guys. They seem to think the problem is that there's white leftists who by and large make the movies and TV shows. As they see it, if they could just get some white right-wingers to make some films, why, they could counter their own bad image. Everybody agrees with them, or so they think. It's just that the media has cowed people into silence with anti-white supremacist propaganda. They simply don't want to accept that the problem isn't that movies and TV shows take them out of context or distort their image. The problem is the movies and TV shows present them exactly as they truly are, exactly as the public knows them to be. And their own pathetic attempts at filmmaking simply reinforce every negative impression people have about them. It will be impossible for them to change that perception, A, because it's true, so it's not perception, it's reality, and B, these white supremacists couldn't tell a good story if Alfred Hitchcock rose from his grave and made the movie for them. So what happens when someone has neither the aptitude nor the attitude for what they're attempting to do? They fail. And if they raise a bunch of money for a crowdfunding, what happens? They wind up with a big budget failure. See, that's what the studios understand about movies that these Nazi nerds never will. Having a big successful crowdfunding is simply the beginning of making something a steadily profitable enterprise. You have to keep the customers coming back. But there's something else about these angry Nazi nerds' so-called attempts to make their own media that proves why they'll never be anything other than a handful of nuts online. One or two of them may make $1 million in crowdfunding. But after taxes and expenses, that money dries up pretty fast. And also, where's their track record of sales? Shouldn't they be able to demonstrate how each one of their comic books or whatever grows in sales every month? I guess they could if they put something out more than just once a year. See, that's what Rebels Run and the rest of these schemes are about. The inbreds behind them only manage to put out one book and that's it. These hate tracks take a year to make and then after that, nothing. That's not a going concern. One comic book every year is not a business. It's not even a side hustle. If you want to make a comic book, you're supposed to have an issue every single month, or at the very least every other month. These guys can't even make one quarterly. It's the same reason they fail to make any movie franchises either. No one wants to see their movies to begin with, so they never get the chance to make any sequels. And that strikes at the heart of why woke keeps winning, while the Nazi nerds keep failing. What they put out doesn't capture the imagination. The people who give them money for a crowdfunding aren't doing it as anything other than a protest vote. There's no excitement or enthusiasm behind the people making this dreck or the empty, soulless trolls who give them what few pennies they have to support it. At some point, you have to appeal to a general audience, and general audiences are the very people who these online racists hate. The morons you see yelling woke and forced diversity and nobody wants to see black people in movies, they're not the general audience at all. They're just a tiny handful of online bigots, and if you try to appeal to them, well, you might be able to pay next month's rent with that $800 you get, but you won't be doing much more than that. Even the racist knuckle-draggers who wasted their county check on this trash don't actually like it. And without enthusiasm, you don't have a fan base. You don't have the raw excitement that you need if something is going to become part of pop culture. Same as I told you about Gina Carano, they don't talk about her or her projects. There's no anticipation from them to see what she's doing. They don't have any interest in her at all, and it shows. These racists can't create imaginary worlds that people want to get lost in, because when your entire story is about phony grievance, manufactured outrage, and basically Fox News talking points on a movie screen or a page, even your own supporters don't want to escape into that. They'll give a few dollars as a political statement, sure, but you can't permeate the culture or build a media venture on political statements. You need an enthusiastic and excited fan base who love what's being created, not people who are merely supporting it because they think it'll make a few liberals angry. Woke works. Woke wins. Because the movie studios and or comic book companies, they at least put out their product consistently. And it's actually interesting. They create stories, characters, and places that a primary audience wants to escape into, and they put it out with enough frequency that they can make an ongoing business out of it. One comic book every 18 months isn't going to cut it. A 2-bit operation like Shapiro's will never make a franchise out of any of his movies unless they can put out at least one sequel a year. Not all mediums are created equal. They each have their own rules and requirements, but one thing that all mediums have in common is that there's a requisite minimum of frequency that has to be reached if you want it to influence the culture. Hell, if you even want it to be a steady stream of income. You'll never be able to influence the culture if you only put something out once every blue moon. But these clowns don't respect anyone, not even their own customers. They see them as rubes, suckers ripe for the picking. And they're right. It's all a grift, it's all a hustle, and not even a productive one. They'll keep at it until this latest grift dries up, and then they'll move on to something else, most likely some pretend political organization, or possibly even a religious one. They don't want to make their own media, they just want to complain about black people, and that doesn't inspire anyone, not even their own. Yes, people will give the local white nationalist nitwits some outrage dollars as a kind of protest purchase, but that runs out pretty fast unless you have something compelling to offer. And phony white outrage isn't compelling. You can't make phony grievance against black people into the next Star Wars or Avengers. People won't line up at the multiplex to see some neo-Confederate superhero either. And as long as there's a few angry racists mad at a world that has left them behind, these Nazi nerds will have a few losers to help them cry in their beer and a few fools they can skim some dollars off of. But what they won't have is a media that makes them feel like they're so special, which is what they really want, to be validated as the end-all and be-all. They're the last ones to figure out they're totally irrelevant. They're whining, but no one is listening. And that's how all good stories end. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Sherman Marshall, Loke Thies, Sabrina, Richard Allen Lovell, and Montrez Braxton. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.